Okay, Charles, I think we can go ahead and get started.
Well, good morning, everyone. This is Charles Neal, President of CRCBR for 2020, and I'd like to thank you so much for joining us for the first ever Zoom webinar with CRCBR. This is certainly unprecedented times that we are entering into here and experiencing, and there are lots of benefits I think we can look at and see here that we are getting more adept at doing things with technology that we're not used to. It's forcing CRCBR to look at new avenues to reach our members and provide value for them. And we're definitely thankful for that. So I just encourage everybody not to be discouraged during these tough times. Take time to reconnect with your families, loved ones, colleagues. Take time to reorganize, strategize, and prepare for the future. Our country and our region and our industry are super strong and resilient, and I know we will come out of this stronger. So please be encouraged on that. I also want to let you all know that CRCBR's leadership and staff are all here to help you to build a strong future and to help you out with things that you may need today or tomorrow. And if you need anything, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Let us know how we can support you, and we will do the best we can. Before we start, I'd like to give out a big shout out to our CRCBR Alliance sponsors. Their support for our organization is critical. We really appreciate them, and we encourage you guys as you need things that these Alliance sponsors can help you out with to seek their guidance and support and send business their way. Before we start, some housekeeping issues I'd like to put before you are that our speakers will start the program with their comments. As you listen, there'll be a chat box that you can ask questions in, and it's located at the bar at the bottom of your screen. Following the presentations, the speakers will address as many of the questions as possible. Now, as we get started, I'd like to introduce you to our speakers. So we have Gary Smith of BassDunklin, an attorney focusing on general business, consulting, succession, and restructuring. We'll also hear from Tom Phillips, a senior project manager for Ranger Construction, which is a commercial construction company, and followed by Garth Dunklin of BassDunklin, an attorney focused on commercial real estate, as well as one of our key educators for commercial continuing education for CRCBR. So I'd like to thank all these guys here helping us out with speaking today, and thank everybody who is listening. And I'll turn it over to Gary to kick things off.
Good morning. Well, I appreciate everybody coming out and tuning in to listen to a little bit about what's going on. Some of the information may be old that you hear because, gosh, it happened on Friday or Monday or even Tuesday or today. There's a lot of stuff coming down the pike with regard to potential economic help for businesses. And so what I wanted to focus on this morning were some of the highlights of ways that you can actually get cash to help your business or get cash or help your customers or clients get cash. I'm going to run through some things pretty quickly. One thing you'll notice on the slide here is I've got a couple links that you can use to be able to start your search for additional information. What I'm going to talk about first is this idea of this Paycheck Protection Program loan. And this has been a very interesting thing to go through with Congress and with the act that finally got passed, because of the nuances of how you determine how much of a loan you can get and how much of it you actually have to repay. To give you the broad strokes of it, under the Paycheck Protection Program loan, you are able to get a loan, and this would be from your bank, not from the SBA, but you're able to get a loan for basically 2.5 months of your payroll costs, based on what your payroll costs have been over the past year, the past 12 months. So what you would be doing is taking the amount you've spent on payroll, which is your gross wages plus state taxes you've paid. And also, you get to count group health insurance premiums in that amount. So you would take that amount you've paid over the past year, divide that by 12 to get your average, and then multiply that by 2.5 to get the amount you can borrow. Now, this is available not only to incorporated or organized businesses, but it's also available to independent contractors and sole proprietors. There's only one limit that applies, and that's you can't count compensation for any individual in excess of $100,000 a year. So if you're paid 120 or 150, something more than that, for purposes of determining the principal you can borrow, you are capped at that $100,000 amount. Now, the biggest benefit with regard to this Paycheck Protection Program loan is you get it forgiven. The amount you can get forgiven is based on how much you actually spend for rent or mortgage, for wages, payroll to employees, or for utilities. But it's how much you spend during the first 8 weeks after you get the loan. So if you spent a ton of money in the 9th or 10th week after you get the loan, that doesn't count with regard to what you could get forgiven. So those are some of the nuances that people have got to figure out with regard to not only what can you get in terms of a loan, but also, okay, when do I have to spend it? Now, if you didn't spend it all, it's still not a bad loan. And the reason for that is, for whatever you don't get forgiven, you have a 10-year term to pay back, and the interest is going to be capped at 4%. So, you know, that's not that much of a downside with regard to what you could end up with if you didn't spend it all on approved expenses. So that's the Paycheck Protection Program loan. The banks have been trying to figure out what their process is going to be, and I think the Treasury Department has upended that process a little bit today because the Treasury Department released an application form for the loan. So now everybody can go out, fill out their application form, go to their bank, and have their bank tell them, yeah, we don't know what to do with that yet. Some of the banks I've spoken with have said they hope to have the program in place by the end of April. I think that the Department of Treasury is going to be pushing them hard to get it in place much sooner than the end of April. And I think the way the Department of Treasury is going to push that is by, to the extent the bank doesn't put a process in place, Treasury Department's going to put a process in place for them. So that's on the Paycheck Protection Program loan side. The other side of it is the SBA Economic Injury Disaster Loan. This is something that's a loan directly from the SBA, and so you have the ability to go and apply for it right now online through the SBA. And the SBA has two different parts to it. The first part is a $10,000 grant that you can get, and that grant is not one that you would have to repay. The second part of the Economic Injury Disaster Loan is a true loan. There's no forgiveness for this, but it's a loan that has up to a 30-year term, and again, interest is capped at 4%, so that you'll see interest rates right now around 3.75% from the SBA. And again, this Economic Injury Disaster Loan, you'll sometimes see it noted as the EIDL. That's something that's directly from the SBA. You're not going to your bank, you're applying to the SBA online. The SBA already has its process in place, and you can run with that today. Flipping to the next piece on the SBA 7A options, the SBA has agreed to pay principal, interest, whatever payments are due under 7A loans for 6 months. That's not a deferment. That's not anything you have to repay at any point. It's just the SBA is covering all those loan payments for 6 months. That's again something that you have to go through your bank, because your bank is going to be your 7A lender if you happen to have one of those loans in place. The other thing that the SBA has done has loosened the guidelines for getting a 7A loan, so that hopefully during the next few months, that might be easier for people. I've got at the bottom some North Carolina resources. There are some different foundations. One is like the Golden Leaf Foundation, where they're doing grants to businesses for up to $50,000, for example, through that group, to help through whatever the economic downturn may be for your business. With regard to that foundation and some of the other resources, they are looking harder at what's your actual loss versus are you just planning or are you just preparing for a loss and seeing what might happen. That's definitely something to take a look at through the NC Chamber. The other thing I will push is if you're looking at the North Carolina Chamber of Commerce or you look at the US Chamber of Commerce, they have some really great resource guides that they're updating that you can click on and get some pretty easy and quick answers. The overall thing I just want to underline from this is you should definitely be looking into the benefits you can get from the SBA now, which is going to be under that economic injury disaster loan. And then also be keeping up with your bank with regard to the Paycheck Protection Program loans, to the extent those would be useful for you. And then also if you have a 7A loan or any of your tenants, clients have an S7A loan, that's going to be useful for them to look at that, basically SBA paying it for 6 months for you. I'm going to stop there and go ahead and throw it over to Tom so that he can pick up with his points and we can have questions at the end.
All right, thank you, Gary. And good morning, everyone. Glad you could join us this morning, and hope everyone is well in these uncertain times. Back to the introduction, take time for family in the construction industry right now as we try to maintain as much as possible business as usual. I could not be busier than I am now trying to fulfill everyone's needs for answering questions about how we're proceeding with the virus, if we're still in business. Can you get us pricing for this deal? Can we still proceed with that deal or not? So things are still happening, which is a good sign. I'm going to start this morning talking about inspections. There's been a few hiccups along the way, but the bottom line is Mecklenburg County Building Standards has come out and said they are proceeding with business as usual with a few protocols in line for each inspection site. The biggest thing is that when an inspector shows up on site, they want to maintain social distancing and make sure that everybody on site is. And sometimes that requires us as the contractors to clear the building or site from any workers so that the inspector can walk on site and be able to maintain the 6 feet of social distancing. We've been fortunate enough to have that happen in a pretty timely fashion. There's been some mishaps where maybe instead of the next day inspections, it's taking 2 days. But I have not heard of or experienced any inspections that have not taken place because of the coronavirus. There's a couple of other options they've listed out for us to be able to do, like live remote inspections, where we can FaceTime an inspector. There's a few provisions around that where it can't be the final inspection or an electrical inspection where the inspector needs to see things on site. We have not had to implement that in any of our site inspections so far. We've been able to maintain the in-person inspections. The other thing that Mecklenburg County came out with was a third-party inspection, and that's kind of a cumbersome process that a contractor needs to be approved through Mecklenburg County and then meet all the requirements from a testing standpoint that an inspector would have. So I haven't heard of anybody utilizing that. The biggest hiccup with inspections has been with the fire marshals. Last week, they came out saying that they were going to stop all non-essential inspections. But we got that cleared up after talking with city attorneys and Mecklenburg County, and now they're back on the same page where they will go out and do in-person inspections. And once again, there may be some delays, a day or two, but we got a final inspection last Friday, and we're able to move somebody in on Saturday. The question kept coming up: are they an essential business? They told us they're a sign company. They make signs for Atrium Health, so they're essential. That's not for me to determine what's essential and not. The good news is that the state of North Carolina and Mecklenburg County are considering construction to be essential, and therefore we're still able to man our job sites and hopefully finish projects on time as promised. The virus obviously has brought up a lot of site health concerns, and we've been implementing procedures on site for proper hygiene, where we're trying to have all of our porta-johns with hand sanitizer and soap or water, and then also the social distancing, trying to maintain 6 feet between workers. That can be very difficult, especially with some of the trades that have to work together. But I try to tell everyone involved that it's critical that we proceed with the social distancing requirements so that the governmental officials don't step in and say, hey, social distancing is not taking place on construction sites, therefore we think we need to shut down construction sites. If commercial construction sites get shut down, then I think everybody involved in this call is going to be directly impacted, because it's going to really stop deals from taking place and tenants being able to move into buildings and contractors being able to finish buildings. So we're trying to maintain social distancing and not overload the jobs. And most contractors that we talk to are doing the same thing. I did come across a piece. I'm fortunate enough to be here speaking with you this morning, but there was a piece in the Journal yesterday that there is a coalition called 4C that was started, Charlotte Commercial Construction Coalition. Ranger is not part of that presently, although we're going to look into it. There's 24 general contractors, and basically that coalition is trying to work with one another so that we can all maintain proper protocol and social distancing, and in addition work on keeping the government officials to know that we're doing our part and that construction is essential to continue, because just like the restaurant industry that's been impacted, if you shut down construction, you're going to throw all those workers out onto the streets without jobs and paychecks. And obviously that'll be detrimental to our economy. Ranger as just an upfit contractor, I don't know how many of you know of Ranger Construction, but we just do interior upfits in office buildings and industrial buildings, medical facilities. We're not doing any of the out of the ground projects right now, but a lot of the out of the ground contractors I've seen where they're now starting to implement taking workers' temperatures when they show up for work, and then turning them away if they have to. We haven't gotten to that point. As an upfit contractor, we can keep our job sites to 10 people or less, or keep them in different rooms without having hundreds of people on site. We don't have contractors, or we're not doing a high rise where we got 300 people showing up to work at one time, which is critical. One of the items we wanted to touch on was the labor market. So far, it's been minor. There's been some layoffs because of some slowdowns and some jobs put on hold. But for the most part, as long as we can keep construction moving, we can limit the layoffs. There have been several jobs that have been either put on hold for virus concerns where it's occupied and they don't want any additional people coming into their facility, or more importantly, the one that always concerns me is market conditions, and people don't want to spend the money in these uncertain times. So they're pulling back and saying, oh, wait a minute, we may have spent $20,000 on permitted construction plans, but we don't want to go and spend another $100,000 or $200,000 on doing this upfit at this time until we have a better handle on when we're going to come out of this and what the market's going to look like. Another item we wanted to touch on this morning was plan reviews. Luckily, plan reviews are moving forward, even though building standards, the office itself is closed. They do have some people in there working, but the reviewers are all working remotely from home. And knock on wood, they seem to be actually coming out a little bit faster than before this whole pandemic took place. Maybe they have less distractions working from home. Bottom line is, we've been able to get the plan reviews done in a timely fashion, and hopefully that will continue. As we look forward to pipeline, I think it's too soon to tell what this is going to do to the pipeline of new and future work. Right now, we're busy finishing jobs that we had. Some of the slowdown in bidding concerns us that, you know, there won't be as many jobs in the future. But as I mentioned, if it's virus concerns, it's a temporary hold, where whether it's a month or 2 months, that job's on hold and we can get back on track once this pandemic's over. If it's cash flow and market concerns, those jobs may never, or those projects may never come back. And that is definitely more concerning. So I think it's too soon to tell on the market, as most of you already know. I think the first 2 weeks I noticed I wasn't hearing from as many real estate brokers about pricing certain deals for them. And now this week we seem to hear more from people. And maybe that's because people realize we got to try to still maintain business and get some things done when and where we can, while practicing social distancing and whatever is required from our government officials. I think at this point, I've given you an update on building standards and construction. North Carolina and Mecklenburg County have covered us as essential businesses. And if we can keep that going forward, we can keep projects and commercial real estate in Charlotte moving forward. On that, I'm going to turn it over to Garth. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Garth Dunklin here. Thanks to everybody for being online. I hope everybody is staying safe and healthy. Teresa asked me to briefly address, before I started talking about deals, the things that have come out of the Real Estate Commission about continuing education and license renewals. So and underlining that any of this is subject to change by subsequent act, depending upon how things play out. Where things stand right now is license renewals are unchanged. Everybody will renew their license on or before June 30th, no matter what, whether you take a CE deferral or whether you met your CE requirements or not. All license renewals are still going as a normal process. When it comes to continuing education, things are a little bit differently. As most of you are probably aware, the Real Estate Commission has canceled in-person classes and authorized in synchronous classes online. There are two options. You can either complete your continuing education using those online classes, or if you don't do that, then you can request from the Real Estate Commission a 90-day deferral, which will be automatically granted to September 30th. And if you request that deferral, then after July 1st, you would have to take an elective to cover your elective. If you did not have an elective in place, and you would have to do that before September 30th. If you have not taken the update this year, you would have to take another elective to update, to replace the update by September 30th. And requirement for the following license year. It is likely right now that in order to avoid confusion, the Real Estate Commission will not be offering the update class in advance of September 30th in order to keep people from being really confused about what's going on out there in the marketplace. So that's something to keep an eye on as well. Looking at, I apologize for sort of the distractions, folks. I just got to notice that my battery. At the slides, can you flip that? So we go over to the slides. I apologize for the background noise, folks. My apologies, everybody. I have had a disaster here with our issues. Okay, as far as contracts go and how you need to deal with them right now, the first thing you need to keep in mind is where are you in your timeline? And what your context. Okay, again, everybody, my apologies. It's the way things go sometimes. Okay, my apologies. You want to keep in mind where you are in your deal timeline and the context of things. Excuse me. And what type of deal you have. And again, this is going to be kind of 35,000 feet. And you also have to keep in mind that things might change. But if you're early on in the due diligence in a contract, it's a very different discussion from being close to the end of due diligence and having difficulty getting third-party reports and things of that nature, which is a different discussion to have in the context. I have a lot of discussions going on with clients right now, and most people are looking at some form of tolling of the time periods in a contract, frequently tied to whether or not things are unable to be done as it relates to COVID events. One of the things that has, to Tom's points, created issues with is people's ability to do certain things is actually still available. So you have a reluctance on some people's parts to agree to extensions. So far, most of the discussions I've had with clients have been around that type of tolling agreement, and in the context of the fact that things might change, they have been related to if there's a COVID event, we'll do an extension or a tolling, and if there's not a COVID impact, it'll be business as usual. I've only had one contract situation where somebody was what you might say unreasonable and wanted a $20,000 payment in order to adjust the timelines in a contract. So you really sort of have to look at where you are in your deal timeline and how the circumstances might approach it and deal with the other side in context. You know, to Tom's point, a lot of people are finding themselves in situations where they can move forward with transactions, and they're taking an approach of let's be cautious about this together. So far, most people are hoping that we're going to come out the other side on a decent footing and are being cooperative in addressing those. As far as 1031 deadlines go, there is a strong coalition nationally of the Exchange Accommodators Association, NAIOP, the National Association of Realtors, pushing on the administration to extend those time deadlines. They have not yet been extended. So for example, I have a client with a closing deadline coming up on April 8th, and they're nervous. It is generally believed that those deadlines will be changed and extended, but they have not been yet. So keep an eye. I think one of the resource pages Teresa is going to give you on the CRCBR website is the NAR advocacy site. Keep an eye on that to see how things go as far as getting an announcement from Treasury and the IRS that those deadlines have been extended. Talking about closings, they are happening. I've actually had 4 closings in the last 2 weeks. The title insurance companies and the Register of Deeds offices are trying to work with the circumstances as best they can. To the question of can you record, it really kind of depends on whether or not the county has e-recording capability and the people involved in the transaction can access e-recording. Most of the Register of Deeds offices across the state, while they have been deemed essential services and are functioning, are still closed to the public. So e-recording is the only option. A lot of title insurance companies are being accommodating about that. But there are logistics considerations that you have to keep in mind. You got to be getting documents to a recording agent. You got to make sure that the e-recording is available. You got to make sure what the hours are of the Register of Deeds, that they're going to be staffing that, because even when you're e-recording, there are people who have to process it. So all that needs to be checked out, and there are glitches. I had a closing that delayed from Friday to Monday because the e-recording system had a glitch. So that's something to plan for in advance. Title insurance companies, most title insurance companies have issued guidance on how they are going to approach closings in this context. Many of them have agreed that with an appropriate indemnification, they will allow a closing to proceed on an e-recording basis. And they also have, at least one title insurance company has issued a guidance that they will allow a closing to proceed even if you cannot record. But there's an agreement that has to be signed about irrevocable delivery of documents and a pretty strong indemnification in order to be able to proceed on that basis. Lenders have been a little slow to the table in terms of developing their processes, kind of akin to what Gary was talking about earlier, in the sense that they're having to figure a lot of things out. And their processes and whether or not they're still married to their old-fashioned or to their, not old-fashioned, their typical closing instructions, which may not even be possible now, is not on the front of the curve, perhaps in the way the title insurance companies have been. Something to keep in mind in that regard is that there is a large coalition of estate planning lawyers, real estate lawyers, and other interested parties who are pushing the governor and the legislature to permit notarization to happen via video instead of in-person meetings. And so that is something to keep an eye on. That has not happened yet, but that would certainly ease some of the logistics considerations around real estate closings. But the good news is that they're still happening. When it comes to leases, there's been a lot of discussion about force majeure, and jumping back to closings, it is not typical for a force majeure provision to be in a real estate contract with as far as contracts and closings go, but you should look and see if there is one. It's not typical. It is pretty common for a force majeure provision to be in a lease, but one of the problems is that most force majeure provisions do not relieve your obligation to pay rent. So it's not a lot of help to the primary thing that most tenants are looking for. One of the things you do have to keep in mind if you're working with a landlord or a tenant is that a landlord is likely going to have loan documents that may say something, and in many instances do say something about the landlord's ability to agree to modifications to leases. Some of those covenants are really very strict, particularly as to certain tenants. And so really the first stop in trying to open a discussion with a landlord from a tenant perspective is to find out what the requirements are that the landlord's lender has imposed. And from a landlord perspective, that's something they need to be mindful of and looking at so that they make sure that they don't default the covenants in their loan documents and trying to deal with tenants. So the terms of the lease, whether there's a force majeure provision or not, and the terms of the landlord's loan documents is going to be the platform upon which that discussion happens. I've had a lot of conversations with landlords recently, and I spoke to one sort of major landlord, and they have been polling other landlords, and there's not really a consistent approach out there right now. The approaches from landlords range from talk to the hand to here's an extensive form you have to fill out to help us comply with our loan documents, to a cooperative discussion. So there's not a consistency, if you will, in thought process out there that's developed yet. Business interruption insurance is something that there's been a lot of discussion about, particularly in the restaurant world, but in others. It seems to be pretty much the case in the marketplace right now that the business interruption insurers are taking the position that the pandemic is not a covered event. And so there has developed a pretty significant coalition of people who are pushing Congress, similar to what happened after 9/11, to deal with legislatively whether or not business interruption insurance provides coverage for landlords or tenants in this context to cover income flows and other things. So that's a pretty 35,000 foot look at things. To a point that Tom made about tenant upfits, a lot of people are having to approach that cautiously when they have leases that are either under negotiation that involve upfit or in process. And how are we going to deliver how are we going to deal with our delivery obligations as a landlord? Our upfit timelines, our open for business timelines and things of that nature. And a lot of that can depend upon whether you are whether construction and permitting and things of that nature, as Tom alluded to, is an essential service in an area. I've talked with some clients who actually have business operations in areas where construction has, not in North Carolina, but in other states, been shut down and deemed not an essential service for commercial projects in certain areas. So it's something that you have to look at on a case-by-case basis in that context. And I've used up a lot of time. So I think it's time for me to turn it back over to Teresa, and I want to apologize to everyone again for the confluence of absurd circumstances at the start of when I was supposed to talk.
Well, Garth, thank you for taking the technology to what everybody else is experiencing out there in all of our Zoom meetings. So thank you for being our guinea pig. Now it's all done and nobody else is going to have problems like that. I've unmuted Tom and Gary and Garth, and we did have one question for Gary, and we'll start out there. If other questions are out there in our group, please type them into the chat room. Gary, will the loan amounts be forgiven or will they be considered a taxable income? Tom, will Mecklenburg County consider essential status for brokers? Have you heard anything about that? Or Garth, you may have that.
I haven't heard anything about that. So
what you were asking, is there a potential change in Mecklenburg County on essential status for brokers?
Yes, like others in the state.
Everything I have heard is either not addressed it or that it might, because of how we have been conducting ourselves, go in the opposite direction.
One thing I'll throw out there is, if you've looked, Mecklenburg County's order has issued additional clarification and guidance specifically on brokers. and how you can conduct site inspections, walkthroughs, and closings, as well as how you can conduct showings. They're pushing everything to be virtual except for like final walkthroughs. And in final walkthroughs, they want to severely limit the number of people that can be there. But if you look on the Mecklenburg County, there's a clarification to the order that they issued, because the initial order they sent out was, no, you can't do anything.
I think that that is limited to residential transactions, Gary.
Okay, cool.
Garth, are you seeing lenders actually move forward on loans, or have you seen pullback? And then by product type, investment sales, owner occupied?
My scope of experience with that is really limited in the closings that I have been doing. Only one of them was financed by a bank, and it was so late in the game that it's probably not an indicator. As far as commitments and term sheets that were out there, I've not seen those be yanked yet. But the other closings I had were either privately financed or were cash deals, so I don't have a good sample size.
Milton has asked, any estimate on how long it might take a tenant to get through the SBA 7A program process? That's for Gary.
On the 7A process, given it's driven by the banks, the traditional time frame for the bank was around 60 to 90 days. What the SBA has done is the SBA has removed a guarantee requirement and has removed a collateral requirement. And then additionally, the SBA has stepped up to say instead of 75% of the loan being guaranteed, we're going to guarantee 100%. Their goal is to shrink that process for the banks, because the bank isn't going to have to, in essence, take any risk on the loans. But I'm still not sure how much we're going to get that process cut down with the banks.
Well, with that, I don't have any other questions in the chat room, unless either of you have. Just one. Tom, have material prices changed due to supply chain issues?
It's probably more specific to the product. Like steel still continues to go up. The biggest issue with material, we haven't seen not being able to get it at all, but doing upfits, we have our subcontractors going in and out of supply houses, and each and every supply house has changed the way they allow people in. You can either let one person in at a time, or in some instances, they're not letting any walk-ins. You have to have it delivered. And in the past, where maybe they would have a sales guy make a delivery for you, it has to be just the driver. So there's been some delay in getting materials, but there hasn't necessarily been a lot of price increase to date.
Hey, Teresa, I wanted to jump back to the question about Mecklenburg County. A couple of things about that additional guidance. Number one, it is premised on the transaction being in a vested status. In other words, that it's not still in a free look period or the due diligence period, in order to allow those to continue. I also wanted to note that from my experience, Rebic's webpage is doing a pretty good job of keeping up with the local Mecklenburg order, so it's a good resource to look at for local specific resources that relate to real estate.
Yeah, and that's a great segue, Garth. After this event, or after this webinar, you'll be getting an email from Lauren that will share some links, and it's a resources page that CRCBR has created that will link you back over to Rebec and their resources regarding the orders. If you're doing business in, I think I saw something in Cabarrus County or Gaston County, they have different orders. The North Carolina Association of Realtors has really done a great job advocating on our behalf and making sure that construction at least is flowing and things are happening, and real estate is still moving forward in our economy. So we will send you a link to the Rebec page, as well as some other links to NAR, the National Association, and to the State Association. as well as a copy of this recording so that if you had popped in late or you have any questions you want to go back to, that recording will be made available to you after this.
Can you edit out my Three Stooges segment?
No, I'm going to use that for future reference here on that. So with that, see, no matter what, no matter how much we practice, it still happens. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Charles Neal if you have any additional comments.
All right, everybody, thank you so much for taking the time to join this webinar. I hope that you were encouraged and learned some great things. We thank you so much, Gary, Tom, Garth, for sharing your insights. You did a fantastic job. I think our CRCBR technology is off to a great start, and hopefully it'll continue to be on the cutting edge. So anyway, also keep in mind, tomorrow we're going to do this again for those needing site index training. That will be an opportunity for you to sharpen your skills with that. And all you need to do is register on the CRCBR website. So yeah, thank everybody for joining. Please stay healthy, safe, and strong. Have a great day.
Thank you, Charles.
Thank you.